Now, our next witness, as you know, is anonymous. She is witness W0407 and will be known as Mrs. A.O. The order in her case reads as follows. The name and address of witness W0407, the name of her late husband, and the name of any other member of the witness's family and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by the chair of the inquiry, me, or by the solicitor of the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness 0407 must be referred to only as Mrs. A.O. The order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Identifying information in this case, may I remind you, might extend to very young members of the general family. So be careful, please. Mrs. A.O.
Mrs. A.O., your full name is known to the inquiry. Could you please repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely...
I do solemnly, sincerely...
and truly declare and affirm...
and truly declare and affirm...
that the evidence I shall give...
that the evidence I shall give...
shall be the truth...
shall be the truth...
the whole truth...
the whole truth...
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
And so I should say we've turned off the live stream so that if the witness wants to use her husband's name when talking about him, she can do so without it being broadcast publicly. Obviously, it is covered by the restriction order, so anyone in this room who hears any family names cannot disclose it beyond these walls. You're here to talk about your late husband, and you've described him in your statement as the love of your life.
Yeah.
You got engaged, I think, only 2 weeks after you'd met.
Yes.
And you married 6 months later.
Yes.
And that was in 1974.
Yeah.
What was he like?
What was he like? Well, as I said, the love of my life. Outgoing. Well, we were just a very good couple. We truly believed in... Well, we were together for 4 years before we had my son. And we had the same aspirations, what we wanted for the future. And... Sorry.
It's all right.
We never argued. The only time there was anything that happened between us was when he became ill. And he actually flicked a tea towel at me in his frustrations of the illness that he had before it was fully diagnosed. And that was the only ever thing in that time. He was just wonderful, very hardworking. He worked long hours. There was family business, which he's part of. And, we had a very good future planned.
You had 2 children, a son and a daughter.
Yeah.
But in 1980, your husband became ill. What kind of symptoms did he begin to experience?
He started to have hot sweats at night. And I've never known it when his side of the bed would actually be so wet we had to change the bed. Never seen. We talk about being hot at night and sweating in the summer, but the sweats that my husband endured were horrendous. And he then developed something in his eye. And he was working, they had which he went away from where we live in a different town, and he went to an optician in this small town, and they said it's not it's not an optical issue, it's medical. He was sent up to our local hospital, and then eventually, a knock on the door, and my local GP was at home and came to tell my husband that he had leukemia.
He had AML, acute myeloid leukemia, diagnosed in December 1980.
Yes, yeah. And we were drip fed for a long time because he was quite ill at that time. It would be like treating diabetes. He'd have a tablet, and we could live with this for a numerous number of years. And he did become better, because by that time we just moved house. My daughter, before my husband was diagnosed as what was classified as a missed cot death, was disabled as a result. We just moved house, and thankfully that also helped him because it gave him something to focus on. We had a lot to do to this house, and to bring it up to standard and modernise it, and it kept his mind on other things. But as time went on, it became obvious that the only answer... it was ironic that the pathologist who dealt with my husband at the local hospital lived 2 doors up the road. And when my husband was very ill, I went up and knocked on the door and asked some questions, and he said, "You've got probably 5 years max." And I hadn't heard that before. So a transplant...
A bone marrow transplant.
Bone marrow transplant was technically the only option, yes.
He had an enlarged spleen which led to surgery in September 1982, and then in November of 1982 he was admitted to the Hammersmith Hospital for the bone marrow transplant.
We were told that, well, that was when my GP came, he was gobsmacked that he hadn't picked up the size of my husband's spleen when he examined him, because he'd been fit and his stomach muscles were so tight they couldn't feel the spleen. But it was part of the transplant he had to have a splenectomy to make the transplant take better. That's what we were told at the time, yes.
And so the bone marrow transplant was undertaken, and your husband was nursed for a significant period of time in isolation in a sterile environment in the hospital.
Yeah. And
he was regularly given platelets through a Hickman line, you recall.
Yeah.
And over the following months, he would come home occasionally, but he seemed to be very susceptible to infections.
Yes. I even was allowed to give him his platelets, because during that time in hospital, when he was in isolation, he could only have 2 visitors a day. They could stay all day, but of course we all had to gown up and go through all that because he had no immunity to anything. The platelets he was given all the time. And once they deemed that the marrow had started to function, then he was sent home. And he definitely home for Christmas, as I've shown you photos of what he looked like at that time. Yes, but he did. And because you tend to worry, my children were very young. Then they would have been like 2 and 4. And so they would have the childhood ailments, although it wasn't obvious, but my husband obviously was susceptible.
And he came down with measles and other infections, and you describe him as constantly in and out of hospital.
Yeah.
And he became iller and iller. Ulcers, blisters on the skin, loss of hair, general fragility. To the extent that he wasn't physically able to even pick up the children and cuddle them.
No. He had, all they kept telling me, it was graft versus host disease. And he was on anti-rejection drugs like cyclosporin A, I think it was, a long time ago now. He wasn't well, and I kept being told he doesn't seem to want to help himself. But in hindsight, and that was because they said, you've got to keep on at him to make him want to fight this. And that's been my biggest regret, trying to do that, because in hindsight, years later, I knew he couldn't do anything about it.
June of 1983, he was back in the Hammersmith Hospital, and you describe that as the beginning of the end. His body began to shut down.
Yeah, yeah.
His lung collapsed, his organs were failing, he had pneumonia and was on life support.
Yeah.
There was one day in June you went to visit him and you returned home and then there was a phone call.
Yeah. It was very hard because I used to, being a mother of 2 young kids and trying to keep normality for these as well, going up there, and I used to go up most days a week. But this particular day, things weren't looking good. And ironically, my husband had gone past the 6-month stage following the transplant when we were told, once you've got to that stage, you've made it. Well, he obviously didn't make it. Although, the irony again is, he didn't have leukemia when he died. The leukemia was cured by the transplant. And my mum's categorically told my father-in-law she is not to go up on her own. So he came up with me. Obviously, it was his son there as well. And we left about 4. I know I was home just before 5, which is when I got the phone call to say that he had died.
And you think, in hindsight, you say that he knew he was dying, and on that last day you felt he was waiting for you to go home before he died.
Yeah.
Now, you understood that he died effectively from something called graft versus host disease.
That's what I was told, yeah.
Which is a medical complication following the receipt of transplanted tissue.
Yeah.
And we've got his death certificate. Can we have up on screen, please, Henry, 0407005? And if we look at the causes of death, we see there set out cardiac arrest, cardiogenic shock, renal failure, pneumonia, graft versus host disease post-transplant for CG leukemia. And you knew it wasn't the leukemia, as you say, that was the cause of his death, because that, in fact, had been eradicated through the transplant.
Yeah, that's what I was told, yes. Yeah.
And so that was June 1983, and you were left a widow to bring up your 2 young children, then I think about 5 and 3, on your own.
Yes.
Then in July 1992, 9 years later, you received a letter out of the blue from the Hammersmith Hospital.
Yes.
We'll have a look at that. It's 0407002, please, Henry. We see it's dated the 18th of July 1992. It's from Professor Goldman, and it says, "You may be a little surprised to hear from the Hammersmith Hospital after the passage of some considerable number of years. Nevertheless, an aspect of your husband's management has recently been drawn to my attention, and I would be very grateful if you could make contact with me." And you had no idea what that was about?
No.
You did make contact with Professor Goldman, and you did go to the hospital to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
What did he tell you?
He told me that they'd gone and investigated slides that they'd kept of my husband, and that he had HIV. And that I had to undergo, well, he wanted me to undergo an HIV test, which I did at that time. I found that pretty horrific because over the years, and as I showed you the photo of my husband, I became aware at that time in 84, 85, you saw lots of AIDS victims in magazines everywhere, and I kept thinking they looked just like, my husband looked just like them. So although it was a shock, it sort of reinforced what I had felt intuitively over the years, that he might have been there, but I had no proof. I couldn't do anything about it and go in touch. And so it's still horrible to hear that, because I was thinking, back then, you were given 10 years if you were lucky to live. That's what was out in the press if you were HIV positive. And I thought, what if I had been infected? And nobody had told me all those years before, as you will come on to in a minute. I know I won't preempt you, but it's horrific. You know, what if I'd been and had numerous partners, which I hadn't, but there were so many what-ifs that was going through my head once I knew that.
And you were told by Professor Goldman that your husband had had HIV, that had been ultimately the cause of his death.
I think,
or had contributed
so.
to it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that he'd been infected through the platelets given in the course of his treatment for leukemia.
Yeah.
And you put it this way in your statement: for 9 years, you'd been soldiering on in ignorance.
Well, yes. Yeah, I knew nothing. I mean, I had my gut react feelings, but I had no proof or anything, yes. And then you sort of put it away and move on, because I had nothing. Nobody ever told me anything.
Did Professor Goldman tell you why you were only being given this information in 1992?
I was led to believe at the time that there was a sum of money that people undergoing this could claim, and that he was getting in touch with me to claim this money, because after 10 years it was going to be gone. So I only had the year to do all of that. And also he wanted me to go out to the press to try and get other people to come forward for this sum of money. And being the type of person I was, I did want to do that. I felt morally that I should do. But my mother said to me, be very careful, because the profession that I was in, it would have been held against me and at that time. And I think she was right, so I didn't do it. And even my visits up to London, I never said, when I wanted leave of absence from work, I said I was going for women's gynecological problems and not what I was going for, because I didn't want anybody to perceive what could have been.
And your mum's concern about you going to the press and saying what had happened was the stigma that attached to HIV and AIDS in 1992.
Yes, yeah.
You did have the HIV test yourself, it was clear, but the process of waiting for the results was an anxious one for you.
Well, yes, yes, it was, but although I kept thinking, I'm sure I'm okay, yes. But you still don't know, do you?
You were given by Professor Goldman a copy of a study that had been published in a medical journal in March 1987, and you were told that it related to your husband.
Yes.
And we're going to look at that study. It's 0407003, please. We can see the date of the publication. It's March 1987, accepted for publication March 19th, 1987. And it's entitled HIV Infection Due to a Platelet Transfusion After Allogenic Bone Marrow Transplantation. And it's reported in the European Journal of Haematology in 1987.
Yeah.
And we can see, if we just look at the top, the summary, it talks about I think it looks like it says 30-year-old.
It is a 30-year-old man, yes.
With leukemia, received a bone marrow transplant from his histocompatible sister in December 1982. It talks about his post-transplant course being complicated by grade 3 graft versus host disease and multiple infections until his death from pneumonia. And then it says he was later found to be seropositive for anti-HIV at the time of his death. It talks about the retrospective analysis of stored samples. And then it says at the end, although it's unclear whether his clinical course was due to AIDS, exposure of an immunosuppressed patient to HIV may be associated with more rapid development of clinical disease. Now, there's more detail about the particular case in the study itself, but it's clear that this refers to your husband.
Yes, and I was told it was by Professor Goldman, yes.
And we'll just look at a few passages from it, because it's important, Mrs. AO, in particular from the inquirer's perspective, to see what was being said in 1987. So we see in the first column, it says, the risk of acquiring infection with the human immunodeficiency virus HIV from transfused blood products has led to the introduction of routine screening of volunteer blood donors for serum antibodies to HIV and the subsequent exclusion of seropositive donors. However, recipients of blood products donated prior to the introduction of screening may yet develop HIV-related illnesses. If the chance of receiving an infectious blood product is directly related to the number of units transfused, the patients who require prolonged blood product support, such as your husband, such as recipients of allogenic bone marrow transplants, will be at greatest risk. And then it goes on to talk about a report from France in 1985 and then investigations carried out in the United Kingdom. And if we look over the page, at the top of the page, it says, we report details of the one patient found to be seropositive for anti-HIV and the events preceding his death 6 months after BMT. And then it goes on to explain in the section headed antibodies to HIV that samples of sera from the patient had been frozen at various times through the transplant period and were available for analysis, and goes on to explain the analysis that was undertaken. If we go to the next page, please, Henry. We look halfway down the left-hand column. It says, by D+120, the patient had received platelets and red blood cells from a total of 108 different donors. The Regional Blood Transfusion Centre at Edgware was consulted, and investigations were undertaken to identify the source of the virus and the passively acquired antibody. And then it goes on to set out under the heading Identification of Anti-HIV Positive Blood Donor the steps that were taken to identify the potential donor who may have been the source of the HIV infection. And then under the heading Discussion, it talks about how the HIV infection may have affected the patient. It says the HIV infection may have been responsible for at least some of the problems encountered at his post-transplant course, and sets out 2 factors that support a causal role for HIV in this patient. I won't go through the detail of it all, but if we go on to the last page, please, Henry. Having talked about the clinical illnesses that the patient identified, it says, in retrospect, the entire episode may have been due to acute HIV infection and was therefore mistakenly attributed to graft versus host disease. And then it says, secondly, the terminal...
I think we're on the wrong page.
I'm so sorry. Yes, my apologies, Henry. It's the page before that. It's my fault for the way in which I've got it printed out. So it's the bottom of the first paragraph. It's in the left-hand side. In retrospect, the entire episode may have been due to acute HIV infection and was therefore mistakenly attributed to GVHD. Secondly, the terminal multiple infections of this patient may also have been HIV-related, and it goes on to explain why. So we can see from this, in relation to your husband, investigations undertaken sometime after 1985, but clearly before the early spring of 1987, contact having been made with the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgware, investigations having been undertaken to try and identify the source of the donation, but none of that communicated to you.
No.
Did Professor Goldman explain, as far as you can recall, why you hadn't been told between 1987 and 1992, given that this shows the position was clearly known by 1987?
I don't remember anything to do with that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
No.
I think I got so having to go through all the procedures of claiming this sum of money and all the legalities that was associated with that. And I don't even think, to start with, I mean, I read this case study, and it's again, reading it now, I keep going over different things. Why did it take so long? How long was that case study being done before it was published? There's so many ifs and questions that come out from this now, and in hindsight, all these years later, it doesn't help, does it?
And you set out in your statement that you think you were told that the other recipients who of platelets from this donor or products that could be traced back to this donor.
I don't know if it was that donor, but at the time my husband was in the Hammersmith Hospital, there were several other patients undergoing bone marrow transplants, and I was led to believe that they had all died. I don't know why. I mean, what from with it's the same. I just presume after all those years later, I would presume it was, but I don't have any evidence for that.
You and your husband knew the risks associated with bone marrow transplant, but you'd not been told anything about risks of infection associated with use of platelets or other products? No.
And of course, as I said earlier, we were just told once you get past 6 months, you're on to a winner.
And you believe he died unnecessarily, that's your phrase in your statement, that he would otherwise have had a good chance of survival because the bone marrow transplant itself had been successful in eradicating the leukemia.
Yeah. But at the time of his death, I was told, because of the collapsed lung created by the HIV, that he would have had permanent lung damage. So, and it sounds horrid, but in many ways, I just felt that my husband wouldn't have wanted that poor quality of life. And that's what I had in my mind for those years, and because I didn't know about the HIV at that time, that he wouldn't have wanted that poor quality of life as he'd been this fit human being. You know, it just was horrendous, really.
Now, because of the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS, you told only a very small number of people when you learnt this news in 1992. Yeah. You told your mum, your brother and your sister-in-law.
Yeah.
And you only told your children when they reached adulthood.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little, what was the impact of losing your husband and the father of your children at such a young age?
Well, I gave up work when I was expecting my son here, because maternity leave was only just coming in at that time and we didn't understand it all, so we decided it's all right, just, you know, he said, I'll be the main bread earner, you be a stay-at-home mum. At that time, I also, he said, because we obviously planned for the future, you might as well pull all the money you paid into your pension, pull that out now because it's worth more to us now, we can sort that out later. Well, after his death, I had no money. I had to go back to work, and thankfully I had a career that I could go back to, but I couldn't go straight back in. I had to fight hard. I needed support with that because I had to earn money. I went back and did, and then temporary contracts for a while, and I couldn't have done that if I didn't have my mother and some very good friends. Because also, what is horrendous about all this is my mother was widowed in the February when I was widowed in the March. And it helped me considerably to have Mum around. And both of us became mother and father to my two children, especially with. She had to have lots of time spent on her with and things like that. And I was trying to balance my son's, you know, his well-being against her well-being, get a career going again, earn the money to provide what we wanted to do for the two children. And it took a long time, but I did it.
And your children grew up without a father?
Yes. And a grandfather, but that's nothing to do with that. Yeah.
And you've very recently become a grandmother.
Yeah.
And she will not know her grandfather.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Now, Professor Goldman told you of some form of compensation or financial support scheme that was available from the Department of Health, and that, as you understood it, was his reason for contacting you in 1992. And you did receive money. You made contact with the Department of Health.
Yes.
And you did receive a sum of money for you and for the children. Yeah. You told us you had to sign an undertaking about, we've heard about it from other witnesses, but you've produced a copy, so we're just going to look at that. It's 0407004, please. And we can see the first page is a letter from the Department of Health, 15th of January 1993. It says, the Secretary of State has decided that your late husband qualifies for a payment of $80,500 as an infected person with dependent children under the scheme for those infected with HIV through blood or tissue transfer. And then it sets out a condition attaching to the payment, which included an undertaking that had to be signed by you. And if we go over the page, we'll see a copy of the undertaking. It's not the one you signed because you sent that one back.
Yes.
But this is what you were asked to sign and did sign. And it says this, in expectation of receiving from the Secretary of State for Health the sum of $80,500, we undertake with the Secretary of State for Health that we will not at any time hereafter bring any proceedings against the Department of Health, the Welsh Office in Northern Ireland, the Department of Health and Social Services Northern Ireland, the Licensing Authority under the Medicines Act 1968, the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, any district or regional health authority, any special health authority, any National Health Service Trust, any recognised fund-holding practice in Northern Ireland, any health service board, or any other government body as on behalf of the estate or dependents of, and then there's your husband's name, deceased, involving any allegations about matters of policy or operational concerns concerning the spread of the human immunodeficiency virus or hepatitis viruses through blood products, whether fractionated or not, or tissue transfer. And then it goes on to give a definition of what's meant by matters of policy or operational concerns over the page. So that's what you were asked to sign, and you did, because this was money that was going to help you and help your children.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's maybe to most people sounds a lot of money, but it's not. When it came with loads of restrictions. It was split between my 2 children and myself. The proportion I had, I got eventually, because I used the solicitors that were put forward, the National Health, wherever it was, came, and but the children's sum of money, it wasn't for me. It was put away till they were 18, and then I was able to get hold of it and invest it for them where I wanted it invested, but I had to wait till they were 18 for that.
And just one final question from me. You did tell your children what you had been told in 1992 when they became adults. What was it like for you telling them, and what was their response?
I can't remember. Can you?
I don't remember the conversation. No.
But I did, and explained to them. But I mean, my son has vivid memories of AIDS adverts on the TV, which made an impact on him even before I'd ever told him about that, wasn't it? Yeah. And we were talking about that recently, and I can't even remember the advert, but it's a famous one. If you Google it, you can find it. And I tended to block lots of these things out, and I tried to obviously go on the positives, Look what we've done, basically. Where we are.
Do you recall if you had any other communications from Professor Goldman? I think you've shown me a letter which he wrote asking if you'd managed to get the financial compensation, I think was the phrase he used, from the Department of Health. Was there any other communication?
No. That was the last. And I can't even remember what I wrote back. I presume I did, because all of that happened pre-mobile phones, pre us all having computers in our homes, basically. And so there's no records and word that I can go back and look at. No, I don't remember anything.
Okay. Thank you. Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I've raised some where, that report was done, case study. How long in advance was that? I don't think you can answer that question. Did they look at the slides to preempt that case study? I still don't know. Obviously, I just presumed why they took so long to tell me was because of that money. But, I mean, there's horrendous issues there. If I had been infected, there's loads. But other than that, no, I don't think so.
And I think we're trying to find out the answers to some of those questions.
Yes, because we know that Professor Goldman's no longer alive.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
And, the person who wrote the case study is.
Yes, and contact is being made with at least one of the other authors, possibly more, to see what can be found out.
Yes, which would be wonderful to see. Thank you.
Sir Brian.
But when you say the person who wrote the case study, there are a number of names at the top of the article, one of which is Goldman's.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have. I meant to highlight that. Yes, he is one of the authors of the study.
I think.
No, but Professor Goldman himself is one of the contributors to the study.
Yeah.
So there can be no question but that he knew of the contents of the article, and indeed, being the last named person, may very well have been a principal author of the paper in the usual medical tradition. In his absence, that's a reasonable inference, is it not?
It is a reasonable inference. It's an irresistible inference.
Yes.
There are at least 2 of the other authors who we know to be alive, and we'll be making contact with. Contact has already been made with one of them, and we'll be making contact with one of the others.
In the absence of information to the contrary, I would naturally conclude would I not, that the article was in preparation and ready for submission sometime in 1986?
Yes.
Thank you. One thing I would like to ask you, you must have realised once Goldman had spoken to you that, and shown you or told you the article, that someone had been in possession of the knowledge that your husband had been infected with HIV, and that HIV might very well be the cause of his death back in 1983. Did that knowledge do any further damage to you?
Perhaps it was a frustration for me that he died unnecessarily, I felt, because of being contaminated by HIV when the transplant had worked and he didn't have leukemia anymore.
So it gave you that additional worry?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And you know, it does impact on your life, but because I had those 8-9 years where I didn't know, I sort of tried to move on and provide stability for the children and trying to develop my career, which I had to do to earn. I had to up my pension and work hard for that. And it was hard because we were going to do all that as a team, and we weren't a team to do that, so I did it all on my own. I had so many things put in front of me in being a woman trying to go up the ladder, believe it or not, and I was told things like, you can't expect to get on in this profession, you took time out to have your children. You know, horrendous things I had to put up with, but everything that was put in my way, oh, you can't get on because you haven't got a degree, because when I started off, you didn't need a degree. I went to and I did it that way. So then, when my children were quite young, I went off and did the OU degree at home. Everything they put in my way, I batted out the way, you know, because I'm a bit determined. and I worked up the ladder, and I became, by the time I finished, because I had to keep doing that to compensate for those years where I had pulled out my pension in those very early years for what we planned to do as a couple. So there were loads of other issues, but we had to get on with it. Nobody there to help us. I had to get on and do it, except my mum.
Well, thank you very much for your evidence. It's one of the few witnesses to tell us about platelets being the cause of transference by HIV.
Yeah.
And the story that you tell us of your resilience in that situation, and indeed your resilience coming here to tell us, is very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, can I just say that I appreciate that I was called as a witness, and I think we've had an awful lot of support here over the 2 days, and prior to this, with people emailing me. I mean, I've had lots of support from your team, whoever they are. Yeah, but all of you. It's been excellent. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. So if we could just have 2 or 3 minutes, we need to sort out the live stream again and just...
Well, let's take 5 minutes and then be back for our final witness of the day.
Thank you.